So apparently, there are no more books for men getting published. To which I say, cheers to that. Welcome back, everybody, to me talking about something book adjacent. And you may ask, why am I shirtless? Well, it's because I can do that on YouTube and women can't. And this is a video about privilege and sexism. Yeah, no, it's not very subtle, but we don't do subtlety around here because subtlety is not masculine. And this is also about masculinity, or what some people claim it might be. Anyway, if you want to know, this is about something that comes up every couple of weeks, every couple of months, something like that on the internet, where someone claims that men are no longer reading, or if they're no longer maybe reading, they might not be reading fiction. And to which I say, well, that's clearly bad because, you know, no matter your gender, it's good if you read. But that's usually where our opinions diverge, because the argument then goes, men are no longer reading because there are no books published for men. And there are no books published for men because the mainstream publishing industry is only following BookTok and thus only publishing romance and romantasy, which usually follows with, you know, claiming that romance and romantasy are trash or maybe even porn. And the argument then, in some cases, goes, well, we need to save all those poor women by preventing them from reading romantasy and romance and publish more books that men can read because they are really about manly virtues or whatever. This is, of course, all wrong, bullshit, and borderline fascist, which is kind of what we want to talk about today. So I will look at the argument of men no longer reading and why that might actually be the case. Then we'll look at why a lot of romance or romantasy is currently published, or at least being perceived as getting published. And then we'll talk about where the whole argument about romance and romantasy leads, which is, once again, as I said, very, very dark places. But before we move any further, one final thing that we need to clear up here. There are no books for men. And there are no books for women. There are no books for non-binaries. The reason being, there is no book police that knocks down my door if I pick up Fourth Wing, just as there is no book police that kicks down any woman's door when she picks up a Conan novel. Anyone can read whatever they want. What there is, however, is a gender police that tries to explain or decide what is manly, what is womanly, and these are obviously the only two options that there are. It's a gender essentialist thing that goes down some very, very dark roads we are not going to spell out here, but yeah. It starts with T and it ends with Earth, is what I'm saying. But what there is, of course, is also capitalism, which intersects with the patriarchy, which intersects with fascism, because those three things have often, you know, always hung out together, work really well together, and that leads to marketing trends, and that's kind of what we need to go to. Now, that has been cleared up. Let's talk about the supposed male reading crises. Alright, now for now, let's just assume that all these statistics claiming that men are no longer reading are in fact academically sound. And let's just give that argument. What we need to look at first is that these are usually statistics from the US, because book discourse online is very US dominated, and thus from there on kind of spills out into the English speaking world and, you know, the larger Western Europe and so forth, places that, you know, reactionary fascists would call the West, and I would probably call the global North. So we are not talking about the entire world, but we have already narrowed down our focus a lot. This is important. Alright, beyond that, let's look at the fact and go like, well, maybe men are no longer reading a lot. Why would that be? Now, the argument that I'm going to make is that this is because of, well, specific ideas of masculinity that have gained a lot of traction over the last 60, 70 years, what with, you know, changes after and backlash to, like, feminism in the 1950s, 60s, and so forth, which is about defining what masculinity means. Under a wonderful neoliberal, late capitalist system, what that means is men need to make as much money as possible, which means they need to go and, I don't know, study STEM or get an MBA and then find some way to, well, exploit the rest of the world as much as possible to gain money, which they can then, you know, invest in status symbols, which oftentimes include women. Once again, this is all gender essentialist. What that also means is that reading fiction is not seen as a masculine thing to do. It's not seen as something that a man performing masculinity would ever do. That's the first important thing here. And then, when we look at the question, like, so why are men maybe reading nonfiction if they are reading books? Well, nonfiction books can be seen as a step towards, gaining all those levels of success that a man is supposed to find. You can read nonfiction as educational material. You can read nonfiction that tells you how to be more masculine, how to understand the world better, how to hack the world. It's a lot of self-help stuff in there. And it's, of course, also more science and aligns better with the idea of, the STEM fields that are still seen as, masculine domains in that very narrow idea of masculinity, what masculinity means. Once again, this is why I said these are studies around, from the US and what you might call the global north, because this is a very specific idea of masculinity that is, mostly centered on these areas. So that means that, men are probably more likely to pick up a book that makes them appear to be masculine if someone catches them with that book, because reading is always a performance, at least when we admit to reading, right? So that's why men are no longer reading, or when they're reading, they're usually picking up nonfiction. So what about the fiction for men, the books for men that are supposedly out there? Well, there have been a lot of, white dudes writing books, presumably with white dudes as their target audience in mind for a long, long time. And yes, in, the 70s and 80s, and possibly the early 90s, a lot of boys and men were reading fantasy and science fiction. The question is, what kind of fantasy and science fiction is that, though? Well, it's once again the kind of stuff that has, on the one hand, elements that can be seen as masculine. In fantasy, that's usually individual, heroic men doing heroic man shit, which means being individualist and being very violent, and thus subjugating the rest of the world. It aligns with these ideas of masculinity that are a fairly new construction. In science fiction, it's often hard sci-fi that is full of supposedly scientific elements, or, once again, lots of violence in there. Those books are around and have been around. And a lot of, men read that kind of stuff, were, up to a point, disparaged by less nerdy men for a long time, but have obviously moved into sort of like the center of society, what with the rise of, the knowledge industry, technology, digital technology, and so forth, big tech, basically. So these people that have fond memories of what they were reading in the 70s, 80s, and 90s are now people that have power over at least some parts of, social media and so forth. These books are still being published, so don't worry. We'll move to the next part here. What about everyone else during that time? Well, if you are, say, a woman, if you are a queer person, if you are a person of color, you probably had to struggle much if you wanted to find any fantasy, science fiction, and so forth that, had people in it that look like you, that think like you, that feel like you, that love like you. And what that meant, that those people started writing their own stories. That's the rise of fan fiction in the 80s and so forth. And a lot of it has always been relatively queer and women-focused and so forth, with these marginalized voices creating their own spaces to create the kind of stories that they wanted. The rise of self-publishing, however, made it much more visible, made those voices much more visible, because suddenly these stories did not just hang out on, AO3, but was available on Kindle Direct Publishing, and so forth. What usually happens at that point is that, mainstream publishing takes notice and decides to also publish those kind of things, because clearly there is a market that has been developed by someone else, and now it's time to absolutely commodify the living hell out of it, which is exactly what happened, which led to the rise of, publications that are more inclusive when it comes to their audience and their authors, which is a good thing in general. Now we need to talk about privilege and spaces. See, for the longest time, with those books about, fantasy and science fiction that we already talked about, being available in bookstores, if you are a man or a boy, you walk in a bookstore, you see a lot of fantasy books that are clearly marketed towards you. They have dudes with big muscles and big swords and half-naked ladies lying around at their knees, that kind of stuff, or big spaceships with guns on it. And you're probably alone, because women and girls, which are scary, are in a different section of the bookstore or the library. And now, slowly, they are showing up in your part of the bookstore, in your space. And there are books that are, having more good-looking men that are not just muscles and big swords on the covers, that are maybe attractive to women, and not just, showcase your form of masculinity that you're supposed to get to. That kind of stuff. And that means you are forced to acknowledge their presence, their existence in this space. This is when you lose a specific form of privilege, because privilege in a large case means you don't have to actually see the other. And that can be frustrating and scary. I'm not saying it didn't happen to me from time to time. So, now that's out of the way. We need to look at the next big part here, and that is social media, because a lot of this happened in the early 2000s with the rise of social media, places like Tumblr, LiveJournal, and of course, AO3 and so forth. The thing is, social media is very much about novelty in a lot of ways. And this has only sped up with platforms like YouTube, Instagram, and BookTok and TikTok by now. By which I mean, our attention is only focused on what is currently being published, what is going to be published in the next couple of weeks, and so forth. And capitalism and the publishing industry obviously pays attention to that as well. Why is this important? It is important because it means that a lot of books that are still published, that are still very clearly targeted towards a, audience that tries to perform some weird, antiquated form of masculinity, these books are still getting published, but they might vanish quickly from the shelves because the next new thing is coming out. And all those old books are still around. You can still buy Conan books that have been out for almost 100 years by now. You can still do all of that, but if you go to a ever smaller number of bookstores with ever smaller shelves, they don't have that shelf space anymore. Yeah, you will still get like a Lord of the Rings, and you may get like a Brandon Sanderson, both classic fantasy books that are very clearly not, targeted towards a predominantly female audience. You can find those, but anything else will probably vanish relatively quickly. Like Larry Correia was publishing fantasy this year, presumably because he is done defending the right to arm bears with machine guns, or whatever he usually does when he's fighting these other anti-woke crusades, which is very clearly written for men. You have all of these books getting published, but they relatively quickly slip under the radar, which is social media discourse. And that is the other important element of why it might seem to some people that there are no books for men getting published, which, once again, there are no books for men, but there are clearly books marketed towards a specific form of masculinity, aspirational form of masculinity. This is important. So, what can we say? Yes, there might be a reading crisis, and men might not read as much or might not admit to reading as much because we've spent the last 60, 70 years telling boys and growing men that reading and reading fiction is not what they're supposed to do. What they're supposed to do is go out there and, hustle, grind, and whatnot. And if they do that, they might just read a book about hustling and grinding. And that is one part. The other part is that because of the ever faster publishing cycle and promotion cycle and discourse cycle, books that are very much still out there vanish much more quickly. And that makes it harder to find them. And we also don't pay attention, to classics and books that have been around for, a century by now. Now, let's look at the whole social media thing. All right. Discourse has moved to social media, from one social media platform to the next. Instagram, YouTube, and TikTok with BookTok. What we need to look at here is how social media platforms work and what happens on those. See, Instagram, being an image platform, is, because of sexism and so forth, very much a platform where women have a certain level of success because a male audience is or feels that it has the right to look at women and, objectify them up to a point. So they often skew somewhat female in that regard. The same goes for YouTube. YouTube has an audience that skews masculine, and when you look at women having accounts, they often have like a large male following. They also get like a shit ton of harassment and sexual harassment by men, especially also on Booktube. So that is one important element here. The same does not fully apply to BookTok, because BookTok is mostly women interacting with each other. This is important. Instagram and YouTube have some vestigial sort of forms of communities, of creators interacting with each other, but it's very different from BookTok, which is, the book community on TikTok, which does interact a lot with each other and is basically a ongoing conversation between different people making videos. This is important. Now, when TikTok blew up at the beginning of the pandemic, BookTok also blew up. Added to this, of course, the chance for everyone to actually read more because we were all stuck at home. So that's clear. And since we already established that BookTok was that kind of community by mostly women talking about books to each other, it also blew up. Now we need to talk about capitalism for a second. See, capitalism has been around for a while. Publishing is part of capitalism. And over the last couple of decades, capitalism has gone further and further down the road to short-term profits to maximize shareholder value. What that means is you need to look to find out how to, blow up your revenue in the next quarter, not to slowly develop something for, say, in a decade or so. So when BookTok blew up, publishing very quickly decided to put everything into what was discussed on BookTok. And since that was a community of women, we'll get closer into that. That was a lot of romance, romantasy, and other books marketed towards younger women in a lot of cases. And that's why a lot of this stuff is currently getting published. Right, now let's look at that part, adult romance and romantasy, and what is going on there. You have, on BookTok, in conversations about romance or romantasy, you have women talking to each other about books that have elements of sexuality, romance, and so forth in it. And that is important because it allows women to discuss these topics, to explore these topics, sometimes even darker topics, through the medium of literature and conversation about literature in a way that is separate from, the control of mostly men, the patriarchy. And that is really important. That makes BookTok in this regard to something of a safe space. And if some of these books get a bit more spicy and have a bit more explicit content in that, that also allows women to do that and explore, their sexuality and even more, darker themes around sexuality in, once again, something of a safe space. I'm not saying everything is perfect on BookTok, far from it, but it is still mostly done by women with other women. And that is the key thing here. It also leads to women actually making choices, having, up to a point, sort of power over men. Because a lot of these books allow women to objectify, fictional men, images of men, and so forth, in a way that is a bit of a upturning of the rules of the patriarchy. And this, I would argue, is key. Because at the point where romance and romantasy is, in discourse, reduced to, by some people, pornography or smut or whatever, this is a backlash of the patriarchy. The goal here is to take that form of agency, that form of power and autonomy away from women and take away that safe space where women can have conversations outside of patriarchal male control. This is the key argument here. When booktubers, people on YouTube or otherwise, claim that it is about the quality of literature, when it is about all of these things, when they claim that reading too smutty books that are too dark in their themes and so forth, that is actually harmful towards women, that is a very, very old sort of like part of patriarchal supposed concern that is really about the control of female desire. It is adjacent to the part that needs, we need to protect children from seeing specific things and so forth. And when that is then paired with concern about men not reading enough, what we reach is a bundle of arguments to once again take this form of autonomy away from women, to take away their power over, or their choices when it comes to what they like, what they don't like to talk about, and so forth, to take that away, to take that space away, and bring them back under male patriarchal control. And this wonderfully dovetails wonderfully with, current child protection laws that force, everyone to submit all their data to access Reddit, even, medical information and so forth on the internet. That forces people to, step away from all forms of self-empowerment and so forth. It dovetails neatly with that, which, is where we come back to this being very much an, US-centric discourse. And you may not be aware of this, but, the US is currently falling back into a specific form of Christian fascism, which is all about, taking away power from women. And, I would argue that the current discourse about men not reading is just another step in, forcing women back into a hardline Christian patriarchal control. And I'm not saying that anyone on YouTube who is starting to be concerned about men not reading enough is a fascist, but you are very much helping those kind of people by giving them these arguments, by raising concern about supposedly books that are harming women and also preventing men from reading, and that is something you should probably think about. So, to bring this all back together, we have capitalism finally discovering women as another market, and we have, current reactionary fascism trying to take away women's spaces, and those two things collide, and right now we need to fight back against any argument that takes away these spaces from women. And maybe capitalism will, for once, be somewhat on the side of people trying to do that. I'm not very, hopeful there, because we're seeing where capitalist systems are once again bowing down and buckling, going on their knees towards those fascist regimes, and we should probably oppose that. And if you, after watching all of this and after following my argument, still think that the male reading crisis is the result of not enough books about Swordy McSwordswinger being published, you should probably look at, something more than just the newest release from this week, because a lot of these books have been published this year, and you should really think about what you are doing here. And that's all I have to say on the subject. I would really like to hear your thoughts on this. Down in the comments, like, subscribe, share, do one of those wonderful things. I'll talk to you about something else very soon. And until then, thanks and cheers.